The judge's gavel came down with a sound that echoed through the courthouse like thunder. Danielle Miche, you are hereby sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and reckless endangerment. I watched the man who had terrorized our neighborhood for 3 years get led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit looking suddenly cheap under the fluorescent lights. But let me tell you how a single tow truck visit turned into the downfall of the most corrupt HOA president our town had ever seen. My name is Marcus Chun, and I'm a software engineer who values 3 things above all else: logic, fairness, and my 1997 Honda Accord. Yes, you heard that right. While my neighbors drove Tesla Model S, sedans, and BMW, I cherished my beat-up Accord with its faded blue paint and a bumper sticker that read, "My other car is also old." That car had gotten me through college, my first job, and a cross-country move. It wasn't just transportation, it was a symbol of my journey. When I bought my house in Meadowbrook Estates in March of 2021, I knew I was entering a community with an H. I'd read the horror stories online, but the neighborhood seemed perfect. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained common areas, and according to the realtor, a very reasonable homeowners association. The monthly dues were $150. Which seemed fair for lawn maintenance and snow removal in our Michigan community. What the realtor conveniently forgot to mention was Daniel Mitchell. Daniel became HOA president in January of 2020, right before the pandemic hit. He was a real estate developer in his early 50s, the kind of man who wore designer sunglasses indoors and drove a Mercedes G-Wagon that cost more than most people's houses. His wife, Jennifer, was equally insufferable. Always dressed like she was heading to a country club luncheon, even when she was just getting her mail. For the first few months, I kept my head down. I paid my dues on time, kept my lawn trimmed to exactly 2.5 inches as specified in the HOA guidelines, and painted my front door the approved shade of colonial blue from the pre-selected color palette. I thought I was being a model resident. I was wrong. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in June of 2021. I had worked late the night before, finishing a crucial software deployment for my company. I finally crawled into bed around 3 in the morning and set my alarm for 8. I had a video call at 9, which gave me plenty of time to shower, grab coffee, and look presentable from the waist up. At 7:45, my doorbell rang insistently. Still groggy, I stumbled downstairs in my pajamas to find Daniel Mitchell standing on my porch with a clipboard and a smug expression that I would come to know very well. "Mr. Chun," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "your vehicle is parked in violation of HOA Regulation 3-7-B. You have 15 minutes to move it before I call the tow company." I blinked at him, still half asleep. "What are you talking about? My car's in my driveway." "Partially in your driveway," he corrected, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "The rear bumper extends approximately 6 inches past the property line onto the common sidewalk. According to our regulations, no vehicle may obstruct pedestrian walkways." I stepped outside in my bare feet to look. He was technically correct. My Accord's bumper did hang over slightly, but we lived on a quiet cul-de-sac. There was plenty of room for pedestrians to walk by, and in fact, I'd never seen anyone walking on that particular stretch of sidewalk, except for Daniel on his self-appointed inspection rounds. "Look," I said, trying to be reasonable despite my exhaustion. "I worked late last night and didn't realize. Give me 20 minutes to get ready, and I'll adjust it." "The regulation clearly states 15 minutes, Daniel replied. "I've already documented the violation with photographs. The tow truck will arrive at exactly 8 o'clock. "You already called a tow truck?" I felt my temper rising. "Before even talking to me?" "I don't make exceptions, Mr. Chun. Rules are rules." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and there's a $250 fine for the violation, plus whatever the towing company charges. You'll find the invoice in your email." I wanted to argue, but I had a video call in an hour and needed to get ready. I moved my car, seething with frustration. The tow truck never showed up. I suspected Daniel had been bluffing, but the fine was real. I paid it, chalking it up to a expensive lesson about HOA. But Daniel Mitchell was just getting started. Over the next 3 months, I received violation notices for increasingly absurd infractions. My garbage bin was visible from the street for 6 minutes past the 7 o'clock morning pickup deadline. $100 fine. A small oil stain in my driveway from when I'd changed my oil. $350 fine for environmental contamination. A gnome my niece had left in my front yard after a visit. $200 fine for unauthorized lawn decoration. Each time I protested, Daniel would cite chapter and verse from the HOA regulations, a document that apparently ran to 73 pages of single-spaced text. I started to realize that he was targeting me specifically. My neighbors had similar minor violations that went unnoticed, but Daniel seemed to have a personal vendetta against me and my old car. The breaking point came in September of 2020. I had invited my parents to visit for the Labor Day weekend. They drove up from Ohio in their 2015 Toyota Camry, arriving Friday evening. We had a wonderful weekend planned. A barbecue, a trip to the lake, and just quality family time I rarely got with my demanding work schedule. Saturday morning, I woke up to find a tow truck in my driveway, hooking up my parents' Camry. I ran outside, still in my pajamas for the second time, courtesy of Daniel Mitchell. "What are you doing?" "That's my parents' car." The tow truck driver, a grizzled man in his 60s named Frank, looked apologetic. "Sorry, buddy. Got a call from your HOA president. Says this vehicle isn't on the approved guest list." "Guest list? What?" "Guest list." Frank shrugged. "According to him, you need to submit visitor vehicle information 72 hours in advance. This car's been here overnight without approval." I pulled out my phone and called Daniel. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Mr. Chun, how can I help you?" "You're towing my parents' car. They're visiting for the weekend. Did you submit a guest vehicle notification form 72 hours prior to their arrival?" "I didn't know such a form existed." Ignorance of the regulations is not an excuse. The form is clearly outlined in Section 12-3 of the HOA guidelines. I sent a digital copy to all residents when I took office. I wanted to scream. Instead, I forced myself to stay calm. "Daniel, please. They're my parents. They drove 4 hours to visit. This is ridiculous. Rules are rules, Mr. Chun. However, if you pay the towing fee and the $500 unregistered vehicle fine right now, I can have Frank release the vehicle." $500 plus whatever Frank charged for the tow. I did the mental math and felt sick. My father had come outside by then, looking confused and concerned. He was a retired teacher, a gentleman who had worked 2 jobs to put me through college. Watching him stand there in his worn bathrobe while some power-hungry HOA tyrant extorted me was more than I could bear. "Fine," I said through gritted teeth. "Release the car." I paid Frank $375 in cash. He felt bad enough about the situation that he gave me a discount and wrote Daniel a check for $500 that I knew would clean out my savings account. My parents were mortified and offered to reimburse me, but I refused. This wasn't their fault. As I watched Daniel's Mercedes pull away from my house that morning, something inside me shifted. I'd been raised to follow rules, to respect authority, to take the high road. But there's a difference between legitimate authority and petty tyranny. Daniel Mitchell had crossed a line, and I realized that paying fines and complying with his ridiculous demands wasn't going to make him stop. If anything, it encouraged him. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. That afternoon, while my parents napped, I pulled up the HOA regulations on my laptop and actually read all 73 pages. What I found was disturbing. The regulations had been substantially revised in February of 2020, right after Daniel took office. The previous version had been a reasonable 22 pages covering basic community standards. Daniel's version was a Byzantine maze of rules and sub-rules, many of which seemed designed specifically to generate fine revenue. But it was the financial section that really caught my attention. According to the bylaws, the HOA president had unilateral authority to approve expenditures up to $10,000 without board oversight. For anything larger, he needed majority approval from the 5-member board. I looked up the current board members. and wasn't surprised to find that 3 of them were Daniel's personal friends, including his business partner at his real estate development company. I started digging deeper, requesting financial records as was my right as a homeowner. Daniel dragged his feet, but eventually provided quarterly summaries that raised more questions than they answered. The HOA was collecting approximately $36,000 per month in dues from the 240 homes in our community. That was $432,000 per year. Yet the actual contracted services, lawn care, snow removal, common area maintenance should have cost maybe half that amount. Where was the rest of the money going? I spent the next 2 weeks becoming an expert in HOA law, financial regulations, and community governance. I learned about fiduciary duty, embezzlement statutes, and the legal obligations of non-profit organizations. I joined online forums where other homeowners shared their HOA horror stories and, more importantly, their victories. And I met Barbara Chun, relation, despite the shared last name, who would become my greatest ally in this fight. Barbara was the retired president of Meadowbrook Estates, the woman who had held the position for 12 years before Daniel. She lived 3 streets over in a charming Cape Cod with a garden that violated at least 17 of Daniel's new regulations. Somehow, she never received violation notices. I knocked on her door on a Saturday afternoon in late September, introducing myself and explaining my situation. Barbara, a petite woman in her late 60s, with short silver hair and sharp blue eyes behind red-framed glasses, invited me in for tea. I was wondering when someone would finally stand up to him, she said, settling into a living room armchair. Daniel Mitchell is a cancer on this community. I tried to warn people when he ran for president, but he promised lower dues and better services. People believed him. The dues haven't gone down, I pointed out. No, they've actually increased by $20 per home since he took office. He claims it's for capital improvements, but I haven't seen any improvements. Have you? I thought about it. The common areas looked the same. The playground equipment was still the same old rusted swings. The community center desperately needed a new roof, something that had been on the agenda for years, but nothing had been done. Where's the money going? I asked. Barbara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper even though we were alone in her house. I don't have proof, but I have suspicions. Daniel's real estate company was struggling before he became HOA president. Now, suddenly, he's driving a new Mercedes, and his wife is wearing jewelry that costs more than my house. You think he's embezzling? I think the financial records would tell an interesting story if anyone actually audited them properly. But he's stacked the board with his friends, and most homeowners don't pay attention to the quarterly summaries. Barbara pulled out a file folder from her desk drawer. Inside were newspaper clippings, printouts from property records, and handwritten notes documenting Daniel's various business dealings. I've been keeping track, she explained. Call it a retirement hobby. Daniel's company, Mitchell Development Group, bought 3 properties in foreclosure last year. All 3 were in Meadowbrook Estates. All 3 foreclosed because the owners couldn't pay Daniel's excessive HOA fines. The implications hit me like a physical blow. He's deliberately targeting homeowners to force foreclosures so his company can buy the properties cheap. That's my theory. I can't prove it, but the pattern is suspicious. Elderly residents, people on fixed incomes, anyone who can't afford to fight back, they get buried in violations and fines until they have to sell or face foreclosure. I thought about Mrs. Patterson 4 houses down from me, an elderly widow who'd recently moved in with her daughter. Her house had sold far below market value. I remembered seeing Daniel's company sign in the yard afterward. This is fraud, I said. This is criminal. Yes, Barbara agreed, but proving it requires resources, legal expertise, and evidence that can stand up in court. It requires someone with the time, money, and determination to take him down. She looked at me expectantly, and I understood why she'd been so willing to talk to me. Barbara had been waiting for someone young enough, angry enough, and stubborn enough to fight. I'm a software engineer, Primera, Said slowly. I'm good with data, patterns, financial analysis, and I'm extremely motivated. Barbara smiled, a fierce expression that made her look 20 years younger. Then let me tell you everything I know about Daniel Mitchell's operation. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. Barbara showed me patterns of violations, clusters of foreclosures, suspicious vendor contracts with companies that barely existed. She introduced me to other residents who'd been targeted but were too afraid to speak up. She gave me copies of old financial records from her tenure as president, showing what a properly managed HOA actually looked like. By the time I left Barbara's house that evening, I had a plan. It would take time, patience, and meticulous documentation, but I was going to expose Daniel Mitchell for exactly what he was, a con artist using his position to run a sophisticated fraud scheme. I started by documenting everything. Every violation notice I received got photographed, scanned, and filed with date stamps. I started taking pictures of my property daily, creating a visual record that would prove any alleged violations were fabricated. I submitted public records requests for all HOA financial documents, vendor contracts, and board meeting minutes. Daniel fought every request, delaying and obfuscating, but state law was on my side. He had to comply eventually. While I waited for documents, I connected with other targeted homeowners. There was Robert Kim, a paramedic who worked night shifts and had been fined repeatedly for his work truck being commercial vehicle in violation of parking regulations. There was the Martinez family, who'd been hit with $2,300 in fines for their daughter's birthday party being too loud at 3 in the afternoon on a Saturday. Each person had a story. Each story revealed another layer of Daniel's systematic abuse of power. In November of 2021, I finally received the financial records I'd requested. It took me a week of analysis, cross-referencing, vendor names with business registrations, tracking payment patterns, and following the money trail. What I found was damning. Cliffhanger Daniel Mitchell hadn't just been skimming money or giving himself a modest salary increase. He'd created an entire ecosystem of fraud. Shell companies for lawn care that did minimal work while charging premium prices. A security consulting firm that existed only on paper but received $45,000 per year. Maintenance contracts with his brother-in-law's company at tripled the market rate. And that was just the beginning. The real revelation, the piece of evidence that would ultimately send Daniel to federal prison, was buried in an obscure line item labeled Capital Reserve Infrastructure Investment. Over 18 months, Daniel had transferred $297,000 from the HOA accounts to this investment. The money had vanished into a web of LLCs and holding companies, ultimately ending up as the down payment on a luxury condo development that Daniel's company was building across town. He hadn't just stolen from the HOA, he'd used our money to fund his own real estate projects while driving vulnerable homeowners into foreclosure to acquire more properties. It was fraud on a scale I'd never imagined. I sat in my home office, looking at spreadsheets full of evidence, and realized I was holding dynamite. This wasn't just a civil matter anymore. This was federal fraud, potentially RICO violations, and a level of corruption that would interest law enforcement. But I also knew that going to the authorities prematurely could backfire. I needed everything documented, every connection traced, every piece of evidence locked down tight. I needed to build a case so solid that Daniel couldn't weasel out of it with expensive lawyers and political connections. Premeta need help. Have you ever dealt with a corrupt HOA president or board member? What did you do about it? Drop your stories in the comments. I read every single one, and your experiences might help someone else who's facing a similar situation. The attorney's office smelled like leather and old books, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd been practicing law for 30 years. Sarah Morrison sat across from me, reading through the binder of evidence I'd compiled over the past 2 months. Her expression remained neutral, but I noticed her eyebrows rise several times as she flipped through pages of financial records, property transfers, and documented violations. "Mr. Chun," she said finally, closing the binder, "this is either the most thorough documentation I've ever seen from a civilian, or you have way too much free time." "I'm motivated," I replied, "and I'm a software engineer. Data analysis is what I do." Sarah leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled under her chin. She was in her mid-50s, with gray-streaked brown hair, pulled into a professional bun, and sharp green eyes that had probably intimidated countless opposing attorneys. Barbara had recommended her as the best real estate and HOA attorney in Michigan, someone who wasn't afraid to take on difficult cases. "Let me be clear about something," Sarah said. What you've uncovered here goes beyond typical HOA mismanagement. This is organized fraud, possibly racketeering. The amount of money involved, the systematic targeting of vulnerable homeowners, the shell companies, this is federal territory. I know, I said. That's why I'm here. I need to know the right way to proceed. Sarah pulled out a legal pad and started taking notes. Walk me through your evidence again. But this time I want to know exactly how you obtained each piece of information. If we're building a case, everything needs to be legally admissible. For the next hour, I explained my investigation step by step. The public records requests, the financial analysis, the interviews with other homeowners. Sarah asked pointed questions, occasionally stopping me to clarify a detail or request additional documentation. The shell companies are the key, she said, tapping her pen against a particular page in my binder. You've identified 4 separate LLCs that receive payments from the HOA Premier Lawn Services, Meadowbrook Security Consulting, Elite Property Management, and Residential Infrastructure Solutions. You've traced 3 of them back to Daniel Mitchell or his immediate family members. That's excellent work. The 4th one is harder, I admitted. Residential Infrastructure Solutions is registered to a man named Gregory Walsh in Delaware. I can't find any connection to Daniel. Delaware LLC, Sarah mused. Classic anonymity play. But don't worry if there's a connection. We'll find it. Delaware has disclosure requirements for court proceedings. She made another note. What about the foreclosure properties? You mentioned Daniel's company purchased 3 homes in the neighborhood. I pulled out another section of my documentation. All 3 were owned by people who'd received excessive fines. Mrs. Patterson, elderly widow, accumulated $12,000 in fines over 8 months. Mr. Rodriguez, disabled veteran on a fixed income, hit with $18,000. And the Johnsons, a young couple who lost their jobs during the pandemic, fined $22,000. Jesus, Sarah muttered. And Mitchell's company bought all 3 properties through foreclosure auctions. He bought Patterson's house for $130,000. It's worth at least $300,000. Rodriguez's place went for $95,000 market value, around $280,000. The Johnson property was the worst, $78,000 for a house worth $320,000. Sarah's expression hardened. That's not just fraud. That's predatory lending practices. Exploitation of vulnerable populations. If we can prove intentionality, that he deliberately targeted these specific homeowners to force foreclosures, we're talking serious criminal charges. I have emails, I said, pulling out my phone. Daniel sent violation notices to all 3 homeowners with payment deadlines that he knew they couldn't meet. Mrs. Patterson was in the hospital when he sent her a 72-hour notice to remove unauthorized decorative elements from her porch. She had flower pots, regular flower pots, that had been there for 5 years. Do you have those emails? I have everything. Mrs. Patterson's daughter gave me access to her mother's email account. She wanted someone to hold Daniel accountable. Sarah nodded approvingly. You've done good work, Marcus. Really good work. But I need to be honest with you about what comes next. Taking on someone like Daniel Mitchell is going to be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially dangerous. Dangerous? You're threatening a man's livelihood, his freedom, and his assets. Men like Daniel don't go down quietly. He'll fight with everything. He has lawyers, private investigators, intimidation tactics. You need to be prepared for that. I thought about my parents' car being towed, about Mrs. Patterson losing her home, about all the other residents Daniel had victimized. I'm prepared. Good. Sarah pulled out a contract from her desk drawer. My retainer is $5,000. I charge $350 per hour. A case like this, if it goes to litigation, could cost anywhere from $30,000 to $75,000. That's if it goes to civil court. If we pursue criminal charges through law enforcement, that's a different timeline and process. I felt my stomach drop. I'd saved about $15,000 after paying all of Daniel's fines. $75,000 was out of reach. Sarah must have seen the expression on my face. However, she continued, There's another option. We could file a class action lawsuit on behalf of all affected homeowners. If we can get enough people to join, we split the costs. And if we win, we can seek punitive damages and attorney's fees from the HOA and Daniel personally. How many people would we need? For a strong class action, I'd say at least 20 homeowners with documented damages. From what you've shown me, I think we can get that easily. I nodded slowly. Barbara Chun has been helping me. She knows most of the targeted residents. I think we can organize them. Perfect. Here's what we do. You and Barbara organize a meeting with affected homeowners. I'll attend and explain the legal process. We need signed affidavits from everyone, documentation of their damages, and authorization to represent them. Once we have that, we file the lawsuit and simultaneously submit your evidence to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The FBI, the amount of money involved crosses the federal threshold. Wire fraud, mail fraud, potential RICO violations. This is their jurisdiction. Local police wouldn't have the resources to investigate something this complex. Sarah paused. But I need to warn you about something. Once we notify law enforcement, you lose control of the timeline. They investigate on their schedule, not ours. It could take months or years. I don't care how long it takes, I said. I want him held accountable. Sarah smiled grimly. Then let's make it happen. Over the next 3 weeks, Barbara and I organized what we called the Meadowbrook Justice Committee. We started by reaching out to the most obviously victimized homeowners, people who'd received outrageous fines, faced harassment from Daniel, or lost property to foreclosure. The response was overwhelming. Our first meeting took place in Barbara's living room on a Tuesday evening in early December 2020. We'd expected maybe 15 people. 37 homeowners showed up, some bringing spouses, some bringing documentation of their own violations and fines. Robert Kim, the paramedic I'd met earlier, brought a laptop with a spreadsheet tracking every violation he'd received over 18 months. 63 separate notices, totaling $48,000 in fines. Crime, working night shifts, and sometimes parking his ambulance company's truck in his driveway during daytime hours. The Martinez family brought their daughter, a shy 7-year-old named Sophia, who'd had her birthday party interrupted by Daniel, threatening to call the police for noise violations. The party had featured a clown, summer balloons, and about 15 children playing in the backyard at 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday. There was James Fletcher, a retired Marine who'd received a violation for displaying an American flag inconsistent with HOA aesthetic guidelines. His flag was too large, apparently 3 feet by 5 feet, instead of the approved 2 feet by 3 feet. Susan Puck, a single mother working 2 jobs, had been fined for her grass being a 1/4 inch too tall. The violation notice arrived while she was working a double shift at the hospital. By the time she got home to mow, she'd been fined again for failure to remediate within the specified time frame. Each person had a story. Each story was worse than the last. Barbara called the meeting to order, and I stood up to address the group. Thank you all for coming. I know this has been incredibly frustrating for everyone. I'm Marcus Chun, and about 3 months ago, Daniel Mitchell towed my parents' car and charged me $875 in fines and fees. That's when I decided enough was enough. I explained what I'd discovered: the shell companies, the embezzlement, the foreclosure scheme. As I talked, I watched faces around the room shift from resignation to anger to determination. Sarah Morrison, our attorney, is here tonight to explain our legal options. But I want to be clear about something first. This isn't just about getting our money back. This is about holding Daniel Mitchell criminally accountable for what he's done to this community. The room erupted in applause. Sarah took over, explaining the class action process, the timeline, the potential outcomes. She passed around affidavit forms and engagement agreements. By the end of the night, 42 homeowners had signed on to the lawsuit, representing a combined total of over $600,000 in allegedly fraudulent fines. But Daniel wasn't going to make it easy. The first retaliation came within 48 hours. I received a certified letter from the HOA board meeting. Daniel and his cronies informing me that I was being sued for defamation, harassment, and interference with HOA operations. The lawsuit sought $50,000 in damages. Sarah laughed when I showed her the complaint. Standard intimidation tactic. It's a SLAPP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation. Basically, he's trying to scare you into shutting up. Don't worry, we'll get it dismissed. The second retaliation was more personal. Someone and I had my suspicions about who filed an anonymous complaint with my employer, claiming I'd been using company resources for personal business during work hours. My manager called me into his office, concerned and confused. "Marcus, you're one of our best engineers," he said, showing me the printed email. "But I have to follow up on complaints like this. Have you been working on personal projects during business hours?" I explained the situation honestly. My manager, thankfully, was understanding. "Look, I'm not concerned about your performance. Your work speaks for itself. But document everything. If this escalates, I want to be able to defend you to HR." The third retaliation was the most disturbing. I came home from work one evening to find my old Honda Accord with all 4 tires slashed. There was no note, no witnesses, just clean cuts in each tire's sidewall. I called the police, filed a report, and installed security cameras the next day. The officer who took my statement looked skeptical until I explained the HOA situation. Then his expression shifted. "You're not the first person to report vandalism in this neighborhood recently," he said, flipping through his notepad. 3 other cars in the past month. All owners who'd been in disputes with the HOA. "I can't prove anything, but I'd recommend those cameras. And maybe parking in your garage if possible." I shared the incident with our Justice Committee. Instead of being intimidated, people got angrier. 2 more homeowners joined our lawsuit. Someone created a neighborhood Facebook group documenting Daniel's abuses, and it gained 70 members in 3 days. Daniel was losing control. Andec no Italiano. In mid-December, he called an emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance for all homeowners. The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock in the community center. Barbara and I arrived early with about 20 members of our Justice Committee. We sat in the front row, legal pads ready. Daniel stood at the podium, his usual smug expression replaced with barely contained fury. "This meeting has been called to address serious allegations against the HOA board and its president," he began, his voice tight. "Some residents have been spreading false information about mismanagement and financial These accusations are completely baseless and constitute defamation." I raised my hand. "Daniel, could you explain the $297,000 transfer to Residential Infrastructure Solutions? That line item appears in the financial records you provided, but there's no documentation of what services were rendered." The room went silent. Daniel's face flushed red. "That's a capital improvement investment, clearly outlined in our budget reports." "Which capital improvements?" Barbara asks, her voice steady and clear. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 18 years. I don't see any new infrastructure. The playground equipment is the same rusty set from 2008. The community center roof still leaks. The roads have potholes that haven't been filled in 2 years. Where exactly was that money invested?" Other homeowners started calling out questions. Where did the $45,000 for security consulting go? Why were we paying 3 times market rate for lawn care? Why had fines increased 600% since Daniel took office? Daniel tried to maintain control, but the meeting devolved into chaos. Residents demanded answers, documentation, audits. Daniel's board members sat silently, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Even his allies seemed to realize they'd been complicit in something they didn't fully understand. Finally, Daniel slammed his gavel on the podium. "This meeting is adjourned. Any further questions can be submitted in writing to the HOA office." He tried to leave, but Barbara stood up, her voice cutting through the noise. "Daniel Michel, you are a thief and a fraud. You've stolen from this community, destroyed people's lives, and abused your position for personal gain. We have evidence. We have documentation. And we have 42 homeowners who are suing you and this board for everything you've taken from us." The room erupted in applause. Daniel's face went from red to purple. He pointed at Barbara, his hand shaking. "You will regret this, Barbara, all of you will regret this. Cliffhanger, he stormed out of the community center, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. His board members scrambled after him, looking panicked. I turned to Barbara, who was smiling with quiet satisfaction. Well, she said, I think that went well. 2 days later, we filed our class action lawsuit in federal court. The same day, Sarah submitted our evidence package to the FBI's Detroit field office. The investigation into Daniel Mitchell had officially begun. What we didn't know was that Daniel had one more card to play a desperate, illegal gambit that would ultimately seal his fate and add years to his prison sentence. Have you ever confronted someone in power who was abusing their authority? How did it turn out? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to stand up for themselves. The FBI doesn't move quickly, but when they do move, it's with overwhelming force. Special Agent Rebecca Torres contacted me 3 weeks after Sarah submitted our evidence package. She was in her late 30s, dressed in a conservative gray suit, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my living room as she sat down. Mr. Chun, she said, pulling out a digital recorder. I'm going to record this conversation. With your permission, everything you tell me today is part of an ongoing federal investigation. Do you understand? Yes, I replied, my heart pounding. This was real now. Octwaji real. Good. Let's start from the beginning. Tell me how you first became aware of Daniel Mitchell's fraudulent activities. For the next 4 hours, I walked Agent Torres through everything. She took meticulous notes, occasionally stopping me to clarify a detail or ask for additional documentation. She was particularly interested in the shell companies and the foreclosure scheme. The pattern you've identified is consistent with what we call a bust-out operation, she explained. The perpetrator gains control of an entity with legitimate assets in this case, the HOA then systematically drains those assets through fraudulent vendors and The foreclosure scheme is an additional layer that shows predatory intent. Can you arrest him? I asked. Agent Torres smiled slightly. We don't arrest people based on one interview, Mr. Chun. We build cases. Right now, we're in the evidence-gathering phase. I need to interview other victims, subpoena financial records, trace the money through all the shell companies. That takes time. How much time? Months. Maybe longer. White-collar investigations are complex. She paused, but I can tell you this. What you've uncovered is significant. If everything you've documented proves accurate, Daniel Mitchell is looking at multiple federal charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement from an organization receiving federal funds, possibly RICO violations. Federal funds? I was confused. The HOA doesn't receive federal money. Actually, it does. Your community has sidewalks and storm drains that were partially funded by a federal infrastructure grant in 2012. That makes the HOA an organization that has received federal assistance, which elevates the embezzlement charges to federal jurisdiction. Agent Torres closed her notepad. The important thing now is that you and your group need to let us handle the criminal investigation. Continue with your civil lawsuit if you want, but don't do anything that might compromise our case. What would compromise your case? Confronting Daniel directly, recording conversations without proper consent, accessing documents you're not legally entitled to, anything that could be construed as harassment or intimidation. She looked at me seriously. I know you're angry. I know you want justice. But let us do our job. I agreed, though it felt frustrating to step back after months of active investigation. But Agent Torres was right. This needed to be done properly. The FBI's involvement changed everything. Within days, federal subpoenas hit Daniel's bank accounts, his business accounts, and the HOA's financial records. An IRS agent joined the investigation, looking into potential tax evasion. The Michigan Attorney General's office opened a parallel state investigation. Daniel hired a criminal defense attorney, a shark named Marcus Goldstein, who specialized in white-collar crime. Goldstein immediately advised his client to stop all communication with homeowners and to shut down the shell companies, which was exactly the wrong move. Shutting down Premier Lawn Services, Meadowbrook Security Consulting, and Elite Property Management while under federal investigation looked like exactly what it was: destroying evidence. The FBI obtained warrants to preserve all records before they could be deleted. Meanwhile, our civil lawsuit was moving forward. Sarah had filed for expedited discovery, and the Juja no-nonsense woman named Patricia Williamson had granted it. Daniel was required to produce all financial records, vendor contracts, board meeting minutes, and email correspondence within 30 days. He missed the deadline. Judge Williamson was not amused. She issued a court order compelling production and threatened sanctions. Daniel's attorney scrambled to comply, but the documents they finally produced were heavily redacted and incomplete. "This is obstruction," Sarah said, flipping through the inadequate response. "He's digging himself deeper." She was right. Judge Williamson imposed a $25,000 sanction and gave Daniel 7 days to produce complete, unredacted documents. If he failed again, she warned, she would issue a default judgment in our favor. Daniel produced the documents, and they were devastating. The unredacted vendor contracts showed exactly what Barbara and I had suspected. Premier Loan Services was owned by Daniel's charging $4,000 per month for services that typically cost $1,200. Meadowbrook Security Consulting didn't exist as a legitimate business. It was just a P.O. box in Daniel's name. Elite Property Management was owned by Jennifer Mitchell, Daniel's wife, but the real bombshell was in the email correspondence. In a message to his brother-in-law, dated April 15, 2021, Daniel had written, "Keep sending the invoices at the inflated rate. The sheep don't read the financial reports anyway. By the time anyone notices, we'll have cleared $500,000. In another email to his business partner on the HOA board, dated June 3, 2021, "Target the Rodriguez property next. He's 3 months behind on dues because of his disability payments. Hit him with maximum violations. We can force foreclosure by September and pick up the property for 70 cents on the dollar." There were dozens more, each one more incriminating than the last. Daniel had documented his entire criminal enterprise in writing, apparently believing his Gmail account was private and secure. Sarah compiled the most damaging emails into our amended complaint. The local newspaper got wind of the story and published an investigative piece titled "HOA President Accused of Massive Fraud Scheme." Within hours, it had gone viral on social media. Daniel's reputation was destroyed. His real estate development company started losing clients. His business partners began distancing themselves. 2 of his HOA board members resigned and hired their own attorneys, claiming they'd been misled about the financial arrangements. But Daniel still had one card to play, and it was the most desperate move I'd ever seen. On a cold Tuesday morning in February 2022, I was getting ready for work when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find 2 police officers standing on my porch. "Marcus Chun?" the older officer asked. "Yes. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of cybercrimes, harassment, and stalking." I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. "What?" The officer handed me the warrant. According to the document, I had allegedly hacked into Daniel Mitchell's email account, stolen confidential information, and used it to harass and defame him. The complaint claimed I'd accessed his accounts without authorization and distributed private correspondence to damage his reputation. "This is insane," I said. "I didn't hack anything. Those emails were produced through court-ordered discovery." "You can explain that to the judge," the officer said. "Please turn around and put your hands behind your back." They arrested me in my driveway. My neighbors watched as I was put in handcuffs and loaded into a police car. It was humiliating and terrifying. At the police station, I was fingerprinted, photographed, and put in a holding cell. I called Sarah from the one phone call they allowed me. She arrived within an hour, furious. "This is absolute nonsense," she told me through the bars. "Daniel filed a false police report to retaliate against you. I'm getting you out of here. And then we're adding malicious prosecution to our lawsuit." She arranged bail $5,000 and I was released that afternoon. But the damage was done. My employer had been notified of my arrest. My neighbors had seen me in handcuffs. Daniel had successfully weaponized the criminal justice system against me. What Daniel didn't know was that he'd just committed a federal crime. Filing a false police report is bad enough, but filing false criminal charges as a retaliation against someone cooperating with a federal investigation, that's obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and abuse of process. Agent Torres called me that evening. "Mr. Chun, I heard about your arrest. Are you okay?" "I've been better," I said, honestly. "I need you to understand something. What Daniel Mitchell did today was possibly the stupidest thing he could have done. He just gave us another felony charge with clear evidence of intent. Every statement he made in that police report, every claim he made about you hacking his emails, all documented lies that we can disprove with the court discovery records. So what happens now? Now we move faster. I was planning to wait another month to present our case to the U.S. Attorney, but this changes things. Daniel is out of control, and he's a danger to witnesses. I'm recommending immediate indictment." True to her word, things accelerated rapidly. Within 2 weeks, a federal grand jury had reviewed the evidence. On March 3, 2022, Daniel Mitchell was indicted on 17 federal charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The FBI arrested him at his home at 6 in the morning. Unlike my quiet arrest in my driveway, Daniel's arrest involved 6 agents, a search warrant, and several boxers of seized documents being carried out of his house while news cameras recorded everything. His bail was set at $500,000. He made bail, but the conditions were strict. No contact with any HOA members, no access to HOA accounts, and electronic monitoring. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Daniel as president. Barbara Chun was appointed interim president. Her first act was to hire an independent forensic accountant to audit all HOA finances. The accountant's report, delivered 3 weeks later, confirmed everything we'd suspected and revealed even more. Over 3 years, Daniel had embezzled approximately $847,000 from the HOA. He'd created false invoices, inflated vendor contracts, and transferred money to shell companies. He'd also taken kickbacks from legitimate vendors in exchange for awarding them contracts at inflated prices. The foreclosure scheme had netted him an additional $412,000 in real estate profits. He'd forced 6 families out of their homes, buying their properties at severely depressed prices and reselling them at market value. In total, Daniel Mitchell had stolen or fraudulently obtained over $1.2 million. Our civil lawsuit was strengthened by the criminal indictment. Daniel's criminal defense attorney tried to get our case stayed pending the criminal trial, but Judge Williamson denied the motion. Both cases would proceed simultaneously. Discovery in our civil case revealed more damaging information. Daniel had kept meticulous records of his scheme apparently. He'd planned to write a book about it someday, believing he was clever enough to never get caught. His notes included calculations of how much he could extract from the HOA before anyone noticed, strategies for targeting vulnerable homeowners, and even a timeline for when he planned to resign and move to Florida with his ill-gotten gains. Sarah used these notes to devastating effect. In a motion for summary judgment, she argued that Daniel's own documents proved fraud, intent, and damages beyond any reasonable doubt. Judge Williamson agreed and issued a partial summary judgment in our favor on liability. The only remaining question was how much Daniel would have to pay. The damages hearing was scheduled for May. We presented evidence of every fraudulent fine, every embezzled dollar, every family forced from their home. The accountant testified about the full scope of the financial fraud. Mrs. Patterson's daughter testified about watching her elderly mother lose her home of 30 years. Robert Kim described the stress of receiving violation notices while working overnight shifts, saving lives as a paramedic. I testified about my parents' car being towed, about being arrested on false charges, about the months of stress and anxiety Daniel had caused. The judge listened to everything, taking notes and occasionally asking questions. When all the evidence was presented, she took a 2-hour recess to consider the damages. When she returned, her expression was stern. "I've practiced law for 32 years, Judge Williamson said. I've seen fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. but I've rarely seen a case where someone in a position of trust so systematically and callously exploited their neighbors for personal gain. Daniel Mitchell didn't just steal money, he destroyed families, forced people from their homes, and weaponized an institution meant to serve the community. She turned to Daniel, who sat slumped in his chair, his expensive suit looking rumpled and defeated. The court finds for the plaintiffs on all counts. Mr. Meisel, you are hereby ordered to pay $847,000 in compensatory damages, representing all embezzled HOA funds. You are ordered to pay $412,000 in restitution to the families whose homes were foreclosed, and you are ordered to pay $2.3 million in punitive damages, to send a clear message that this behavior will not be tolerated. The total judgment, $3.5 million. Daniel's face went white. His attorney objected, arguing the punitive damages were excessive. Judge Williamson overruled him. Mr. Mitchell orchestrated a sophisticated fraud scheme that victimized dozens of families. The punitive damages are appropriate and proportional to his conduct. Furthermore, the court awards attorneys' fees and costs to the plaintiffs in the amount of $187,000. Barbara squeezed my hand. Around us, other plaintiffs were crying with relief and vindication. But we weren't done yet. The criminal trial was still coming. Cliffhanger, the federal prosecutors, armed with Daniel's own emails, financial records, and victim testimony, built an airtight case. The trial was scheduled for September 20. Daniel's attorney tried every delay tactic imaginable, but the judge, a stern federal magistrate named Robert Harrison, wasn't having it. As the trial date approached, Daniel grew increasingly desperate. He tried to negotiate a plea deal, offering to cooperate and reveal other fraud schemes he knew about in the real estate industry. The prosecutors weren't interested. They had him dead to rights on 17 felonies, and they wanted the maximum sentence. The trial itself would last 3 weeks, and produce testimony that would shock even those of us who thought we knew the full extent of Daniel's crimes, because, as it turned out, we'd only scratched the surface. What do you think is an appropriate punishment for someone who steals over $1 million from their neighbors? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious to hear what you all think justice should look like in cases like this. The federal courthouse in Detroit was imposing. I arrived early on September 12, 2022, accompanied by Barbara and about 30 other members of our Justice Committee. We'd waited 9 months for this moment. The courtroom was packed. Daniel sat at the defense table looking diminished, his usual arrogance replaced by barely concealed fear. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Park. Her opening statement was devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "over the next 3 weeks, you're going to hear about a man who betrayed the trust of his entire community. Daniel Mitchell was elected to serve his neighbors, to protect their investments, to maintain their homes and common areas. Instead, he saw an opportunity to steal, and he stole systematically, methodically, and without remorse." She walked the jury through the scheme step by step, using charts and graphs that I'd helped create from my original analysis. Shell companies, inflated contracts, embezzled funds, the foreclosure scheme. Each element was laid out with crushing clarity. Daniel's attorney, Marcus Goldstein, tried to counter in his opening statement. He painted Daniel as a well-meaning volunteer who'd made some accounting mistakes, nothing more. The jury looked skeptical. The prosecution's case was airtight. Agent Torres testified about the FBI investigation, walking the jury through bank records and money transfers. The forensic accountant explained how Daniel had hidden the stolen funds through multiple shell companies. Victims testified about losing their homes, their savings, their peace of mind. On day 4, they called me to the stand. "Mr. Chun," Attorney Park said, "please tell the jury how you first became aware of Daniel Mitchell's fraudulent activities." I told my story, starting with my parents' car being towed and ending with my false arrest. The jury listened intently, several of them taking notes. When I described being handcuffed in my driveway while my neighbors watched, I saw one juror shake her head in disgust. "Did there come a time when you analyzed the HOA's financial records?" Park asked. "Yes. I'm a software engineer, so I'm comfortable with data analysis. When I received the financial records through my public records request, I noticed several irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Payments to vendors that didn't seem to exist, contracts at prices far above market rate, large transfers labeled as capital improvements, but no actual improvements being made to the community. Park displayed one of Daniel's emails on the courtroom screens. Do you recognize this document? It was the email where Daniel had written, "Keep sending the invoices at the inflated rate. The sheep don't read the financial reports anyway." "Yes," I said. "That was produced through court-ordered discovery in our civil lawsuit." "The sheep," Park repeated. He was referring to his neighbors, the people who'd elected him to serve them. Does that seem like the attitude of someone making innocent accounting mistakes? Objection. Goldstein calls for speculation. Sustained, Judge Harrison said. Rephrase, Counselor. Park smiled. I'll withdraw the question. The email speaks for itself. The defense's cross-examination was weak. Goldstein tried to paint me as someone with a vendetta. Someone who'd hacked Daniel's emails out of spite. Park's objections shut down that line of questioning. Quickly the court records proved the emails were legally obtained through discovery. Over the next 2 weeks, the prosecution built their case brick by brick. They showed Daniel's personal bank account growing by hundreds of thousands of dollars, while the HOA accounts dwindled. They traced money from the HOA to shell companies to Daniel's personal accounts. They showed property records proving Daniel's company had purchased foreclosed homes at a fraction of their value. But the most damaging testimony came from Daniel's former business partner. Richard Chun, no relation to me or Barbara, who'd served on the HOA board. Richard had accepted a plea deal in exchange for his cooperation. Daniel approached me in January of 2020. Richard testified. He said he had just been elected HOA president and saw an opportunity to make some money. He asked if I wanted to be part of it. What did you understand making some money to mean? Park asked. At first, I thought he meant legitimate consulting fees or something. But then he explained his plan. We'd create fake companies, submit invoices to the HOA, and split the money. He'd control the approval process, so no one would question it. Did you agree to participate? Richard looked ashamed. Yes. At first it was small amounts, a few thousand here and there. But Daniel kept expanding the scheme. He wanted to do more, take more. When I tried to back out, he threatened to expose me. Did Mr. Mitchell ever express concern about getting caught? No. He used to say that HOA members were too lazy to read financial reports. He said we could steal $500,000 before anyone noticed, and by then we'd be long gone. The defense tried to discredit Richard, pointing out his plea deal and suggesting he was lying to reduce his own sentence. But the documentary evidence supported everything Richard said. The emails, the bank records, the shell company, filings, it all corroborated his testimony. On day 15, the prosecution rested. Goldstein put on a brief defense, calling character witnesses who testified that Daniel was a good neighbor and successful businessman. It felt hollow compared to the mountain of evidence against him. Daniel himself chose not to testify. Probably, Wise Spark would have eviscerated him on closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon. Park summarized the evidence methodically, reminding the jury of every victim, every fraudulent transaction, every lie Daniel had told. Daniel Mitchell is a thief, she concluded. Not a petty thief who steals from strangers, but someone who stole from his neighbors, his community, people who trusted him. He targeted the elderly, the disabled, the vulnerable. He forced families from their homes for profit. He lied, he cheated, and when he got caught, he tried to use the criminal justice system to punish those who exposed him. The evidence is overwhelming. The only just verdict is guilty on all counts. Goldstein's closing focused on reasonable doubt, suggesting that mistakes weren't crimes and that the government hadn't proven criminal intent. The jury didn't look convinced. They deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood to deliver the verdict. On count 1, wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On count 2, mail fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On count 3, embezzlement, guilty. Guilty, guilty. 17 counts. 17 guilty verdicts. Daniel's face went pale. His wife, sitting behind him, started crying. Barbara squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. Around us, other victims were crying too, but these were tears of relief and vindication. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 months later. During that time, Daniel's attorneys filed multiple motions for a new trial, all of which were denied. The sentencing investigation revealed even more damaging information. Daniel had been running smaller schemes in 2 other communities where he'd served on HOA boards. On December 15, 2022, we returned to court for sentencing. Judge Harrison had a reputation as a tough but fair sentencer. He'd reviewed all the sentencing materials, the victim impact statements, and the sentencing guidelines. "Mr. Mitchell," he began, "I've been a federal judge for 19 years. I've sentenced murderers, drug dealers, and organized crime figures. But your crime is particularly insidious because you betrayed people who trusted you. You didn't rob banks or deal drugs. You stole from your neighbors, from elderly widows, from disabled veterans. You forced families from their homes for profit." He paused, looking at Daniel with clear disgust. "The sentencing guidelines suggest 63 to 78 months. The government has requested the high end of that range. Your attorney has asked for mercy, pointing to your lack of prior criminal history and your family's circumstances. I've considered all of these factors. However, I've also considered the magnitude of your crimes, the number of victims, and your complete lack of remorse. You showed no mercy to Mrs. Patterson when you forced her from the home she'd lived in for 30 years. You showed no mercy to Mr. Rodriguez, a disabled veteran. You showed no mercy to the Martinez family or the Johnsons or the Kims or any of the dozens of families you victimized." Judge Harrison's voice grew harder. "Furthermore, your attempt to use false criminal charges to intimidate witnesses cooperating with a federal investigation demonstrates contempt for the justice system. That alone warrants significant punishment." He looked at Daniel directly. "Daniel Michel, I hereby sentence you to 84 months in federal prison on the embezzlement charges, to run consecutively with 48 months on the witness tampering charges, for a total of 132 months 11 years in federal prison." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Daniel's attorney objected, arguing the sentence was excessive. Judge Harrison overruled him. "Additionally, you are ordered to pay full restitution of $847,000 to the Meadowbrook estates and $412,000 to the individual families whose homes were foreclosed. You are ordered to forfeit all assets obtained through criminal activity, including 3 properties and 2 vehicles. Upon release, you will serve 3 years of supervised probation and are permanently barred from serving on any HOA or community board." The judge's gavel came down with finality. "Marshal, take him into custody." Federal marshals approached Daniel's table. For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel Mitchell looked truly broken. As they led him away in handcuffs, he glanced back at the gallery where all his former neighbors sat. I didn't feel triumphant or happy, just relieved that it was finally over. Outside the courthouse, Barbara organized a gathering at a nearby park. About 50 homeowners showed up. Along with Sarah. "I want to say something," Barbara announced. 9 months ago, most of us felt powerless. But Marcus showed us that even when facing corruption, ordinary people can make a difference. She turned to me, her eyes bright. "Marcus, you could have paid your fines and moved on. Instead, you chose to investigate, to organize, to fight. Because of you, a criminal is going to prison. Because of you, our community got justice. Thank you." Everyone raised their cups. I felt embarrassed but also proud. This hadn't been about revenge. Not really. It had been about accountability, about refusing to let a bully get away with hurting people. Agent Torres approached me as the gathering was breaking up. "Mr. Chun, I wanted you to know something. The investigation you started didn't just bring down Daniel Mitchell. The information he provided during sentencing interviews led us to 2 other HOA fraud schemes in neighboring communities. You've helped protect a lot more people than just your neighbors." "Really? Really?" "Good investigative work by civilians makes our job easier. You did everything right, documented carefully, preserved evidence, followed legal procedures. If you ever get tired of software engineering, the FBI could use someone with your skills." I laughed. I think I've had enough of criminal investigations for one lifetime. Over the following months, life in Meadowbrook Estates slowly returned to normal. Barbara, officially elected as HOA president in a special election, immediately reduced the Byzantine regulations to a reasonable 20-page document. She cut the monthly dues by $30 per home, while actually improving services by contracting with legitimate vendors at fair prices. The 3 properties Daniel had fraudulently acquired through foreclosure were sold back to the original families at the foreclosure purchase price. Mrs. Patterson moved back into her home, and I helped her daughter install a new security system. The Rodriguez family returned to their house. The Johnsons, who'd relocated to a smaller apartment, were able to come home. The civil judgment remained unpaid. Daniel had hidden assets that were still being tracked down by federal asset forfeiture teams, but the criminal restitution order meant that any money recovered would go first to his victims. As for me, I kept my Honda Accord. I could afford a new car now. My employer had promoted me after everything settled down, apparently impressed by my analytical and organizational skills. But that old car represented something important: staying true to yourself even when others judge you for it. 1 year after Daniel's sentencing, I was washing the Accord when a young couple moved in across the street. I introduced myself. "Welcome to Meadowbrook Estates. If you have questions about the neighborhood, feel free to ask." "Thanks," the husband said. "We heard there was some trouble with the HOA a while back." "There was, but it's resolved now. We have good leadership and reasonable rules." "That's good to hear. Are the regulations pretty strict?" I thought about Daniel's 73 pages of petty rules, then about Barbara's streamlined 20-page document. Tyrant. Fair. Just follow common sense. Be a good neighbor, and you'll be fine. And if you ever think something isn't right, speak up. That evening, I sat on my porch, watching the sunset. The community center lights were on. Barbara had finally gotten the roof fixed and was hosting a movie night. I thought about everything that had happened. It had cost me time, money, and stress. But it had taught me something important. Justice isn't automatic. It requires people willing to stand up and refuse to be intimidated. Daniel Mitchell had tried to bankrupt me with fines and harassment. Instead, I'd bankrupted him. He'd lost everything: his freedom, his assets, his reputation. 11 years from now, he'd walk out of prison to find a world that had moved on without him. My phone buzzed with a text from Barbara. "Movie night starting. Yo coming." I smiled and typed back, "On my way." As I walked toward the community center, I passed the spot where Daniel had threatened to tow my parents' car. That angry confrontation had set everything in motion. Sometimes, the worst moments in our lives lead to the most important ones. Daniel Mitchell had tried to crush me with petty tyranny. Instead, he'd awakened something stronger: the determination to fight for what's right. And in the end, that determination had bankrupted him far more thoroughly than any tow truck ever could. Thank you for following this journey with me. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you've ever faced corruption or abuse of power in your own community, remember, you have more power than you think. Document everything. Find allies, and never let bullies convince you that fighting back is hopeless. Justice takes time, but it's worth the effort. Stay strong, everyone.